Welcome to Blender in Science, Episode 1, a new, less formal format that I'm going to be exploring. Longtime viewers of the channel know that it's very rare that I get behind a camera. I don't have any kind of teleprompter or Zach Friedman's wonderful eyepiece, and so you'll notice that I stare at the points that I want to address. But realistically, what I wanted to do here is just have an opportunity to discuss more direct insights into using Blender for scientific visualization, to explore some breakdown of figures and covers, to work through specific requests, highlight resources, provide community updates, etc., without really having to rigidly script everything. Now, the tutorials and assets that I make are not going anywhere. They're still going to be a feature of the channel. This just gives me an opportunity to more regularly parse together different aspects of the channel. I've really, for a long time, wanted a format for sharing quick tips or explanations that don't really make sense as their own tutorials. And really, I'd like to keep CGFigures focused on scientific visualization, but also have a little opportunity to discuss research, figure creation, and what it means to be a research scientist while doing graphic design work. I'll do my best to add timestamps in all these videos, and after the first few episodes, once I establish a consistent format, I think everything will go a little bit more smoothly. So to start, I'm going to keep the Blender content up front and move any opinion or discussion pieces to the end. For now, we'll get back to just the screen and dive right in, and I'll sort of come back at the end for discussion of resources and some of my inspiration for making tutorials. The last asset video I released was about my Perovskite nodes. The original node allowed for creation of very quick and very customizable perovskites with all kinds of different features, such as lattice tilt or any kind of different aspect ratio that you should hope for, but it lacked one of the features that shows up commonly in these figures, namely the internal octahedral bonds, which you can see right here. So this has been updated and added to the latest version on Gumroad, and today I want to break down a little bit of how I added that capability and to explain some of the logic for how and why I designed the perovskite nodes the way I did. So if we switch over to the Geometry Nodes tab here, you can see when I created this whole setup, I did it in the way that you might for actually creating a crystal lattice. Namely, I made a 3D grid, and then from there, I used it to place a unit cell. So in much the way that you're often taught crystals, you have a unit cell that you repeat in multiple directions to get a lattice, and that was the way that I wanted to do this. Now, normally, I would have started out a project for myself using Arundale's wonderful toolkit. So if we come down here, you see the Arundale toolkit, and under generators, there's actually a grid node that has the 3D grid built in. Now, Arundale actually charges for this set of nodes, and so that meant that I was absolutely not going to release it. I do not release other people's paid products in any format in my own assets because I make everything free and open source, and I'm not going to step on people's feet in that way. I'm really not interested in doing that. Instead, what it was an opportunity for me to build out my own 3D grid from scratch and to include whatever features I wanted. And those actually come packaged with this node, so you have a fully integrated version, you have the individual controls, and everything can actually be broken down by just hunting around, and people want to reuse this, they're more than free to do so. But one of the nice things that came out of this was that it allowed me to break down the different sections of the actual nodes themselves. So whether or not that was the cubic structure, the octahedral portion, or just the center atoms. And so when I wanted to go about and actually start adding in these center octahedral bonds, all I had to do was take the appropriate part of the lattice and add it in the unit cell. So if we just zoom in right here, you can see I have all of the regular inputs, and all of these can be accessed from the Geometry Nodes tab, which you can see right here. And if we come down far enough, we now actually have the new controls for the inner bond size right here, and the bond separation. And so what that actually means is if I just zoom in over here on this single unit, if I grab the bond separation and decrease or increase its integer count, you can see that the separation between the blue and the orange is actually expanding. And this is something that I've wanted to include in a number of these models for a while, so I thought it would be a fun opportunity to break down some of how this actually works. So if we go ahead, come to the octahedral inner bonds, and just open this up, you can see very simply that there's not too much going on. There's an X, a Y, and a Z. These all combine into one final geometry at the end. I instance on the points of the actual 3D grid. So again, the idea of having a consistent lattice, just using a repeat of one motif. I incorporate the tilt that I had before so that I can actually add the tilt that you can see in the background of this particular shot. And let's just very quickly dive through one of these. I'll use Z because it's very apparent how it works. And all of these are just exact copies for the different axes. So X, Y, and Z, they're all duplicates of the same thing. And very simply, all we have to start is a simple line curve. So if I go ahead and hit Alt, Shift, and left click, you can see all I have there is just one line that goes from -0.5 to 0.5. And so when I designed all the unit cells, I wanted them all to have the default value of 1 meter in height. So the octahedra is exactly 1 meter, so obviously minus 0.5, 2.5 is a total distance of 1. I resample this curve, and what that means is that instead of having just 1 point at the beginning and 1 point at the end, I now have 21. The reason I wanted an odd number is so that when I take the attribute statistic, namely the mean of the index, so I've now created, instead of 2 points, I have 21 points. I take the index of each point, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 21. I take the exact halfway point of this, which is what this statistic does, and now I can use a series of math nodes by capturing this attribute at this specific location, and I can essentially create a mask that says, when you go ahead and grab the final mesh, so curved mesh right here with a very simple curved circle, this is how we set the bond radius right there. All I have to do is say, take the indices that are 1, 2, 3 points above this and no further, and 1, 2, 3 points below this. So that's what that actual bond separation is. And assign one color to one of those, and then assign a different color to the other indices that don't follow that rule. So altogether, what that means is that when we visualize the final thing, we just come back right here, let's close that off. We have this structure here, and this is the X, Y, and Z all together, where I now have this point where you can see how many units I've moved away from the center, and that is true for all the axes. Technically, it means that you could control the bond separation of all the axes separately. And one of the nice things is because each of these is its own curved line, so for X, Y, and Z, I can actually scale in any of the dimensions without warping the individual ones. So if I go ahead and grab the X scale here, bring that up to 1.5, you'll notice that the Y and the Z did not distort or squish at all, the way they might have if I had tried to apply the scale uniformly to the whole thing. So for the X1, you'll see X scale pumps into combine X, Y, Z just for that into a transform. For Y, it is the Y scale, and for Z, obviously, it is the Z scale. And so that was a very, very easy way to integrate this feature and include it in the final node network. So we'll just go ahead quickly reload this file. But essentially that was the rough underpinning for how something like this worked. And this is actually a project that I'm going to expand to other crystal lattices. So I recently had a request for sort of molybdenum disulfide type structures, the MXene stuff, if I'm not mistaken, and I might be, but to this and to other lattices such as lithium cobalt oxide, this is something that I want to expand. One of the things that I've always found frustrating about working with some of the actual molecular formats for crystal files is that they just don't quite behave the way that you want to. So it's not like importing a molecule or a protein, which you could do with Brady-Johnston's new molecular nodes or with Atomic Blender. These I find in every figure instance I've ever seen, I usually want much more updatable control. And that was why I integrated everything into one single geometry node platform. So again, you can grab those nodes from Gumroad if that's something that you're interested in. They have been updated. They are a CC0 public domain, and they're free for anyone who wants to use in figures, covers, etc., etc. What I'd like to do now is pivot a little bit and take a look at a figure example, so something that somebody requested. And whenever I get these types of requests, people will often say, can you make a tutorial on this? I usually like to steer away from making tutorials on unpublished data, but I think it's okay in this case to sort of highlight some of the approach and give a rough outline of just the effect. So if we come into a render view here, you can see it's a very simple concept. We have some sort of source of emission here, and there's a bit of a gas cloud surrounding a series of interior atoms that are excluding these exterior ones, and it's all kind of funneling onto a surface. So I'm going to essentially recreate this from scratch now, and we'll just see how we can achieve something similar to this effect and how simple this can be. It's far from perfect, but for the kind of shot that you might anticipate seeing in a figure, not really a cover, so just something sort of side along to convey the rough look. I think this is probably more than sufficient, and there are ways that I'll highlight that you could do this more involved, but they kind of go beyond the scope of what I want as a simple tutorial. So we'll go ahead and just start a new scene here. Won't save. And I'll simply start by deleting the default cube, adding in a simple plane with Shift-A. We'll go ahead, tab into edit mode, S and 5 to scale up, and this will just be our background. I'll label things as I go just for the sake of argument here and have everything be a little bit cleaner. So background plane. And from there, we're going to add in, well, actually, H to hide this first, because the original request I had was for moving on to a kind of flexible substrate. I have tutorials that have covered that, but we'll go over it from scratch from here. So I'll grab a simple plane, tab into edit mode, right click and choose subdivide. I'll hit Shift R a few times to repeat that. And then immediately I'll Shift A, add in an empty, hit R, X, and 90 degrees to rotate that. Now I'll grab my plane again, come to the modifier tab, and we'll add in a simple deform. Now you can see right away it's working, so I'm going to go ahead and use the empty as my origin. And let's just go ahead and take a quick look there. Instead of twist, we're going to shift to bend. And now the one thing that I'd like to do is actually have this not extend over the whole thing and also change the aspect ratio. So we'll grab the plane, hit S, X, and 0.5, and I'll apply the scale with Control A, hit S for top view on my number pad, or 7, sorry, not S, 7 on the number pad for top view. And with Control Tab, I'll come over to the weight painting, grab the little gradient tool here, and simply drag across until I have something just about there. Control Tab again to come back to object mode, and now we can, under restrictions, choose the newly created vertex group. I find this always, or almost always, leaves a small lump, so it's barely perceptible, but you can just kind of make it out right here. So to fix that, we're going to select our plane, tab into edit mode, box select over all these points, just like that. Come to the object data properties and hit remove, and that will flatten out this bottom half very nicely. We can then go back to our modifier tab and change the bend extent however much we want. So that was snapping a little bit there. Let's go ahead and do something like this. We will right click, shade smooth, add in a solidify modifier to give this just a bit of thickness. Something like this should be fine. And to clean up some of these edges, we'll add in a simple bevel modifier. We'll bring the amount down to 0.01 to start. Let's go a little bit smaller, 0.005, and we'll do a count of 2 is okay, let's go 3. So now I want to make sure that I have my plane selected, and we'll just call this layer. And we'll grab this empty by holding Shift, then we'll hit Control P and parent to the object. So what that means is I can now grab the empty and move it around, but what it also means is that I can Shift D, duplicate this plane, hold down Z and move it up, and what this is going to let me do is create a stack of layers. So I can now customize each of these. Let's say I want to change the thickness of this one, we'll bring that down. And let's say I want this one to not bend quite so much, so I'll grab the simple deform and I'll just bend that slightly down, something like this. I could also hit Control 2 to smooth out both of these by adding a subdivision surface underneath the bevel. And so this is a rough, flexible plane system. Let's get to designing that gas cloud and some of the aspects. I want to be able to control all of this in one object as much as possible. Now, if you want to do this in a way that would look much more visually stunning or compelling, you could do a smoke simulation from a point source, and that would be a little bit more involved and really, I don't think, necessary for a quick figure. So instead, we're going to use materials and very simple shapes. I'll go ahead, hit Shift A, and we're just going to add in a mesh cylinder. Hit G and Z to bring that up, zoom out a bit, scale that down, and then R and X to rotate. So I'm going to use this as a kind of point source, G and Y to move that over, and S and Shift Z twice to stay on local coordinates. So I can turn this into kind of a source, S and Z twice again, and this will be the source that we kind of emit from. Now what I'm going to do from here is Shift D, Z, and that will create a duplicate cylinder. Perfect, something like that's fine. Again, we'll just shrink that the tiniest bit, and now we're going to tab into edit mode, hit Alt and A to deselect everything, Z and drag to wireframe, and I'll box select over all of these bottom verts. From there, I can hit G, Z twice, bring that out, something like that, and S and Shift Z twice so that we can scale this up. Perfect. That's going to be our volume cone of gas. From there, I'll just do this roughly by eye, so R and X to rotate, something like that, and we can actually come into a side view, see how flat that is. So R and X, something like this, just gently. I'm holding down Shift so I have more control, and I can move that again. Now I can be a little bit more freeform with this, G and Z just straight down, and we'll move that back and just up the tiniest bit. So that is going to be our cloud source, and obviously this doesn't quite look aligned, so at this point you could make all kinds of adjustments. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to drag that out in the y-axis so that it actually looks like it's projecting kind of from the right area, and we'll just scale that up so it covers right about there. If we come to a top view and we see that's too wide, then we'll just scale in X to drag that down, and we'll scale in Y just a little bit to make that seem more reasonable. Now, to get the kind of gas effect that we're going to do, we're going to come to the shading workspace. And in the shading workspace, we're going to very simply add a new material. So zoom in. I'm going to come to the render properties, change from Eevee to cycles, and I'll use the GPU. Then we're going to hit Z and come into rendered view. And what we want is actually to get rid of this cone, essentially, and replace it with something. So we're not actually going to use the principled BSDF at all. Instead, we're going to Shift A and we're going to look for a principled volume. Just right here. We'll plug this into the volume output, and you can already see we have a bit of a haze. Now, what I'd like to do with that haze is just modify it ever so slightly. So what I can do is I can change the density to make it much more dense, for lack of a more creative way of describing that. I can also change the color. So if we wanted our gas to be kind of a blue or a yellow or red, whatever color you fancy, really. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do to just add a little bit more interest to this, to kind of fake the volume effect, is I'm going to use a texture to control the density. So we'll move this out of the way, Shift A, come to texture, and I'm just going to go with some simple noise. We'll Shift A again, cut a converter, color ramp, put this into the factor, and if I go ahead and Control Shift left click to show what this is doing, you can see I now have this sort of stretched texture right here. And if I bring this black slider up, part of it is black, part of it is white, and those are going to correspond to values of 0 or 1. And everywhere it's going to be 0, there will be 0 density, so it'll be see-through effectively, and everywhere there's 1, there will be some density. I'd like to be able to control the density a little bit more, so I'm also going to add in a converter math, multiply, and we'll connect this into the top socket, connect this into the density, and when we actually go ahead and delete this node so we can visualize our stream of gas, if you will, now I can bring the value up in the multiply and I have this sort of distorted effect. If I really wanted this to be a bit more uniform, I could also hit Control T on the noise texture and then change the type to object or generated, and this just gives me more control of the noise. So I am going to keep generated for now. I can change the noise scale, so 2 will be kind of a more spread out stream, and if I want to do something a little bit finer, I could say 20, and now I have a much more concentrated stream, but you can still see the gaps in between. And I obviously also have control over aspects of the noise, like the roughness or the detail, and I don't have to use noise. I could use any different texture, Musgrave, Voronoi. Noise is just a convenient option. So we're going to do very little detail, and we'll go with a much smaller scale, let's say 3. In fact, let's go with 5. Something like this is going to be just fine. And so you'll notice that it is actually kind of going through at the bottom here, whereas I might want to actually stop on that layer. To be honest, for something as simple as this, I would just cheat a little bit and actually angle this such that you don't see the other side. From here, I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup on this aspect just to have something a bit nicer. So we'll tab into our emitter, grab this top face, and I'm going to hit I to inset, drag that in, and then E to extrude along that normal axis, just so it looks like this gas is kind of coming from somewhere. We'll tab back into object mode, and we can go ahead and apply a very light bevel to this. So again, 0.001 is fine. Let's do 2, Control 2 to smooth that out, and we could start adding some simple materials here. So let's go ahead and just add a very simple metallic shader, kind of standard emission, and we could do something for the planes here. So let's go ahead, crank the subsurf here to 0.25. I'm going to make all of these 0.5, and let's just take a look here. We'll make the subsurface a little bit blue. So now it's impacting this plane. Now the thing that I'd like to do is use this same cylinder object, so I don't have everything named quite well, so we'll take a second to clean this up. So we'll call this emitter. We'll call this gas cloud. What I'd like to do is use this same gas cloud object to scatter something inside and outside. And we're going to do that in a very simple way. So in the Geometry Nodes tab, I'll hit New to create a new Geometry Nodes network. And right away, I'm going to simply drag out and choose Distribute Points on Surface. Distribute Points on Faces, sorry. Then I can use the points, do instance on points, and if I grab this node here, shift in this one, and I'll hit Control 0, that will add in a join geometry, which you can also find under the geometry panel, so join right there. connect both of these inputs, and now I'll drag out from the instance. For record, if you are dragging out and it doesn't work, that's because you need 3.1 or newer. I will do a simple UV sphere. Those are obviously huge and there's way too many of them, so we're just going to quickly make some corrections. Let's go ahead and bring that radius down, and one thing that you'll notice is that these are all terribly distorted, and that's probably because I did not update the scale of this object. So when I do, perfect, everything works. And we'll do just a few more simple things. So I'm going to go ahead and come to Mesh. We'll go Set Shade Smooth right there. And I'd also like to be able to set materials for the spheres. So I'm going to grab a material, set material, and then I can add a new material here. So we'll call this, in fact, we won't call it anything. We'll just make it color for now. Let's go with a light blue, matching our gas cloud. And then we'll choose it right here. So all of these spheres have a kind of blue color, and for good measure, we'll add another one for all the outside spheres. I'm going to choose something kind of orangey. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that these are still really big, so I'm going to bring the radius or the scale down. I'll bring the scale down by holding Shift to select everything, and I'd like all of these to actually be inside the surface. There are very clever, complicated ways of doing this, but the simple, easy, cheating way is to very simply add in a geometry, transform, stick it right there, and now I'm just going to bring the scale down. So what I've effectively done is I've recreated my tube, but now it's inside. Instead of being the actual full big one, it's just a smaller one. I'm using that to set all the points. So you can see all of these are now inside. And if I don't want them to come through this layer because they're going too far, then I can just change the Z scale. And so they'll move closer or farther from this top point, which is also coincidentally the object origin. And that is because of how we made this as a sphere. So if I were to reset the origin here, origin to geometry, you see this will actually change where the Z scale is relative to. So it's still going to work. It's just going to pull them into the center instead of up towards the top point. And either one's fine, so I'll leave it the way it is for now. Again, I'm going to cheat a little bit and use this camera angle to kind of solve some of my problems. Now at this point, how am I going to scatter atoms on the outside? I could just create a simple point cloud and then kind of try and emit them from that area, but instead I'm going to just copy all of these exact same nodes, so drag them out, excuse me, Control-Shift-D to drag down. That will preserve this connection right here. I will connect this last join, or this last set material into the join geometry, so now I have more of them, and I will change the material to this one right there. Now this time, instead of having the scale go small, I'm going to have the scale go large. I will bring the Z in because I want the cloud to be around, not through. And what you'll notice is that now these atoms are not inside, they're all outside. I can also change the density for either of these, so let's say 2, just to make it a little bit more clear what's going on. And I could change the scale of the atoms is what I'm going to call them for now, so that you can see effectively what this does is it is going to encapsulate all these blue inside this gas cloud so that these orange ones can't get to it. And that would be a common theme in plenty of different reaction setups. Either way, this has been a full, start to finish walkthrough of how you would achieve this kind of effect. So to the person who requested this, hopefully this was useful to you, and to people who are working on kind of similar concepts, hopefully this has given you some insight into how you might be able to achieve something like this in Blender. The community feature that I'd like to touch on this week is Microsingularity's latest tutorial for how to make realistic lasers in Blender. This is something that Hans Chu had accomplished with the older geometry node system quite some time ago to great effect, but this new tutorial really makes a lot of this much more accessible and I think a little bit more broadly applicable to a number of things. So it's very, very well detailed, and you can do this with the LuxCore render engine, which is also available for free. So I'll just quickly cut away to a screenshot showing the final effect. So we just parsed through the video here. Let's go ahead all the way to the end, volume scattering, adding an HDRI, and you can see right there, this is a fantastic demonstration of having this go through, even showing some of the aspects of having the beam partially pass through and split in different ways. So you can really make great use of this. As a fantastic tutorial. I expect this to pick quite a bit of traction up, but for those who are interested in these types of topics, it's always refreshing to see something new come out in this space. Big thanks to Michael for putting this together. So one more kind of project development thing I wanted to mention is this metal dichalcogenide construct that I'm putting together. So right now, it's a very, very simple setup where you can control aspects of the X and Y count. Let's go ahead and just grab these over here. You can change aspects such as the bond size, layer height. All of these generally work a little bit. They're not fantastic. So these are a pretty common motif, and I would use something like this in a throwaway shot, a cover that you might see from a distance. There are some problems, and if I zoom in, you'll actually be able to see towards the edge, some of these tend to fall apart, so the bonds will break. There should be one right here, but it's not. What I will eventually be doing with this is much more akin to the Perovskite nodes, where I create a individual unit cell and repeat that in multiple directions, just another lattice, essentially, where you have full control over all the aspects. Right now, this is making use of a bit of a convoluted geometry node setup, and so the rough idea is that I'm bringing in a series of positions, and I'm just offsetting a hexagonal grid. So this is actually prototyping. I used Arundale's hexagon grid, took every other position, moved them up, and then took all of the original positions and doubled their height. So these would be 0, these would be 1, these would be 0.5. I used Brady-Johnston's molecular node right here to find bonds, and that is essentially what's constructing all of these right here. This doesn't give me the control that I want, so what I do want to be able to do is actually take the bond curves and sort of split them in half, much the same way that I prototyped for the Perovskites at the beginning of this, where I could have it be blue halfway and yellow the other halfway down. So eventually I will get around to making a more consistent setup. Again, I think this would be fine if you had, say, a transistor or a layer stack or something, and it's just sort of a throwaway shot, and you don't really need to get nitty-gritty into the details to see that, some of the bonds are missing. So from a distance, it looks good and it's easy to work with as well. So that's a nice little plus. So as promised, I'm back for the kind of end discussion opinion part. And the way that I want to close out is by discussing the video speed controller add-on on YouTube. It's just an extension for Chrome, and what it lets me do is bypass the regular speed limit of ×2. I often watch things at 2.5 to 3 times speed. And that's because running CGFigures is kind of a constant race of keeping up with new stuff. Anyone familiar with the literature knows that you're always reading papers so you don't fall behind. And learning 3D for me was no different. Just a lot of the resources happen to be in video form, and I really wanted to motor through a lot of stuff. One of the comments I saw from, I think, a Blender developer on Twitter was that beginners usually want step-by-step tutorials, and intermediate or advanced users are usually looking for a description of how you actually did a thing or what your thought process was. And so when I try and make a video, I try and include a good mix of those so that it's accessible but also informative. When I'm trying to study stuff myself, usually I'm looking at some of the more developed resources, and I am really trying to motor through to pull out those valuable ideas. So at any given point in time, I have a reading list. Right now, mine consists of work from Stuart Jansen, the incredible development backlogs, which are, I think, 2 or 3 hours each of live stream discussing how video elements were made or actually creating them in Houdini. Your own Klaus has a video with Integma detailing protein construction in Houdini and some of the native aspects that it has. I use Blender primarily, but I like to look at other software to kind of inspire a sense of what can be done and also how to develop that, not just for Blender, but also to integrate into my own work. And so I'm kind of constantly motoring through videos. What I wanted to discuss and why Gerald Undone is on the stage here is just because Gerald is a camera and gear reviewer, fellow Canadian, and I absolutely adore all these videos. So they don't really have too much to do with scientific visualization, but they have very heavily informed how I actually create my own tutorials. In fact, when I watch my older ones, I can hear the cadence that I'm talking in, and I know it was because I was watching Gerald not long before. His stuff is really a masterclass in how to integrate dense content with a lot of technical description, to the point where almost all of his videos end with him saying, if you didn't enjoy this content, try setting the playback speed to 75%. I've had a lot of comments about people saying, I go really, really fast. And it's because I am trying to emulate this information dense style. The great thing about videos, you can pause, you can go back, you can watch it again. But this man right here is an incredible kind of master of the art form, if you want to put it that way. And the reason I want to highlight his work is just because I think a lot of figures, a lot of scientific visualization, a lot of the use of covers, there is the science aspect. There's the data that you're trying to communicate in a meaningful way, but there's also the communication aspect of it and presentation skills and how you present an idea, how effectively, how clearly. Those are very, very essential. So if you really want a fantastic example of content that is engaging, informative, and really clear, while being very information dense, I really would struggle to come up with someone better at this than Gerald is. And that's it. So welcome again to the first episode. I hope we'll have a few more of these going forward, that they could be more regular content. If there was something engaging in here, then consider subscribing. And as Gerald would say, all right, I'm done. And as I would say, as always, thanks for coming out. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing, sharing with your friends and colleagues. And until next time, you have yourselves a great old day.